The President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, seems determined to impose blanket tariffs on America's trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and China. While many reasons for the tariffs have been stated by the Trump administration, the most consequential reason is centered around bringing manufacturing and, as a result, jobs back to the United States of America. This is already a questionable premise, as America decided decades ago to become a service-based economy and allow manufacturing to be outsourced to countries that can make the products at a higher quality for a fraction of the cost. For example, Apple's designed in California and assembled in China practice. Nonetheless, even if we assume that bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US will have a positive outcome, the question of whether imposing a blanket 25% tariff on all products from Canada and Mexico is a reasonable approach. The fact that the president has had to either push the taxes to be imposed later or pardon certain sectors like the automotive sector shows that the implementation strategy was not well thought out and might not be as simple as just implementing blanket taxes or tariffs. It is also important to state that according to various studies, including one carried out by taxfoundation.org, there is a near complete pass-through of tariffs to US importers and consumers. This means a 25% tariffs on a product will result in a price increase of nearly 25% for that product to the consumer. Other studies, including one published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, show that the tariffs implemented in 2018 increased the prices of affected imports by approximately 10% to 30%, aligning closely with the tariff rates imposed. Researchers found that US firms and final consumers bore the entire burden for the tariffs, leading to a net economic loss of $16 billion annually. To understand the weakness of this strategy and come up with a better approach, it is important to consider how tariffs will disrupt established supply chains. As a result of globalization and an understanding of comparative advantage, countries have naturally formed complex and intertwined trading relationships. These are driven by policymakers passing policies that facilitate trade and businesses and companies making strategic decisions to manufacture certain components or products in certain geographical locations that span countries' borders in many cases. For example, Ford produces certain models like the Ford Explorer domestically in the US and produces other models outside the US like the Ford Bronco Sport, which is produced in Mexico. The decision to produce certain models in certain locations are based on strategic approaches based on the demand for certain models in certain markets, manufacturing in locations close to the source of raw materials and input components to reduce lead times and facilitate just-in-time production practices, strategic partnerships, achieving economies of scale, and a lot of other issues. In many cases, companies understand that the components and raw materials will be taxed, so it is beneficial to manufacture the products closer to the raw materials because of all of the benefits listed before, and then pay taxes on the finished products as they are imported into the country. This just gives an idea of the complexity of strategic supply chain decisions of one company in one sector, and the complexity increases exponentially when you consider different companies in various sectors that are vastly different. We'll have a look at a few case studies. The following is a list of 5 different industries, including the time it takes to set up manufacturing plants for each industry, the increase in production costs for domestic manufacturing, and the expected pass-through of tariffs to the consumers. For the automotive industry, the estimated pass-through to consumers is 50 to 80%. The time it would take to establish domestic manufacturing is 1 to 3 years, and there will be an increase in production costs of around $400 per vehicle. In the food and agriculture industry, the estimated pass-through to consumers is 80 to 100%. The time to establish domestic manufacturing is 2 to 5 years, and there will be an increase in production costs of about 10 to 25%. In the textile industry, the estimated pass-through to consumers will be 40 to 60%. The time to establish domestic manufacturing is 1 to 2 years, and there's an increase in production costs of about 20 to 30%. In the semiconductor industry, the estimated pass-through to consumers is 70 to 100%. The time to establish domestic manufacturing is 2 to 4 years, and there will be an increase in production costs of about 30 to 50%. And lastly, the electronics and consumer goods industry will have an estimated pass-through to consumers of 60 to 90%. The time to establish domestic manufacturing would be 1 to 3 years. And lastly, an increase in production costs for domestic production of 15 to 25%. This list basically shows how different industries will have incredibly different outcomes. So imposing the same tariff on every product in these different industries does not seem sensible if you want to have the most optimal outcomes. The outcome of the proposed tariff can be seen in the financial markets and in the overall American economy. The Dow Jones was down 4% for the month up to March 7th, 2025. And the downward trend seemed to be sustained. The actual share price might keep going down or go up as the markets are moved by various factors, and President Trump seems to be going back on some of the taxes, but there has been a clear downward trend on Wall Street as a result of the tariffs. In addition to this, prices of various products in the United States have seen an increase in the days since the president announced his tariff plans. Prices of electronics, automobiles, gasoline, vegetables, fruits, beef, beer, spirits, etc. are expected to increase. The typical American family is expected to see an increase in annual costs of $1,600 to $2,000 due to the new tariffs, according to a new analysis from the Yale Budget Lab. The question is, if Trump is to implement tariffs to bolster domestic production, what would be the best approach? The analysis in previous sections shows that blanket tariffs cannot possibly be justified, especially a value as high as 25%. It is quite obvious that the Trump administration needs to move beyond the blanket tariff policies and take a surgical approach that is based on the following factors. Which domestic industries are to be bolstered? This should be based on long-term strategic growth plan for the US economy. What comparative advantage does the US have in those industries? To what extent are those industries intertwined with foreign suppliers? A detailed analysis of imported and exported raw materials and components is necessary. How much time would be required to create domestic supply chains and manufacturing systems? And lastly, what long-term goals and plans need to be implemented for the successful bolstering of the said industries? Based on a careful analysis of these factors, a long-term development and tariff implementation plan can be put in place with details about dates, tariff values, and possible rebates for specific industries. As mentioned before, the implementation of a big blanket tariff on the same day makes little to no strategic sense. Therefore, based on the engagement of stakeholders and having a collaborative framework, the implementation of tariffs needs to be gradual and staggered. The following is a brief overview of an implementation plan that would incentivize domestic production while minimizing economic shocks, diplomatic fallout, and consumer price increases. For simplicity, the analysis is made for the automotive industry as this industry involves complex supply and value chains, manufacturing systems, and logistics. As a result, this example will be simple enough to follow, but complex enough to focus on most of the relevant aspects of a well-planned and staggered tariff plan. It is also important to note that these timelines should ideally be created in collaboration with key stakeholders and should be tailor-made for each industry or each group of similar industries at the very least. The strategy focuses on imposing tariffs on fully assembled vehicles initially, followed by specific components, with timelines aligned to the practical durations required to establish domestic manufacturing facilities for these components. In the first phase, a tariff of 18% will be placed on fully assembled vehicles, and the rationale behind this is that imposing a substantial tariff on fully assembled vehicles creates a strong incentive for automakers to shift assembly operations domestically. Given that the US already possesses a robust automotive assembly infrastructure, this transition is feasible within the short term. Risk mitigation elements would include clearly defining fully assembled vehicles to prevent circumvention by importing nearly complete units, and offering tax incentives for investments in the US assembly facilities to offset initial relocation costs. The second phase would entail imposing a tariff on intermediate components, and these are components with moderate manufacturing complexity. For example, interior components like seats and dashboards, body panels, and glass components. And the tariff would be 15% on these components. The rationale here is that these parts require moderate capital investment and technical expertise to produce domestically, and the 12 to 24-month window allows manufacturers sufficient time to establish or expand production lines for these components. Risk mitigation factors would include providing grants or low-interest loans for setting up domestic production facilities and implementing workforce training programs in collaboration with technical schools to ensure that the already existing labor pool expands. In the third phase, a tariff of 20% would be imposed on advanced components, which are high complexity components like electronic control units, advanced driver assistance systems, and electric vehicle battery packs. The rationale here is that establishing manufacturing capabilities for high-tech components necessitates significant investment and has longer lead times. So the 24 to 36-month period provides a realistic timeframe for companies to develop domestic production facilities for these critical parts. Again, risk mitigation here would include offering research and development tax credits to encourage innovation in domestic manufacturing and facilitating partnerships between automakers and technology firms to accelerate the development of domestic supply chains for advanced components. And the fourth phase would entail a comprehensive review and adjustments. And here, basically, the government would have to evaluate the effectiveness of the implemented tariffs in increasing domestic production, assess the impact on consumer prices and overall market dynamics, adjust tariff rates and policies based on empirical data to ensure objectives are being met without causing undue economic disruption. This refined plan leverages factual data and realistic timelines to ensure that the tariffs are effective in promoting domestic production without causing unnecessary economic strain. The failure of blanket tariff policies lies in their inability to account for the complexity of global supply chains and the unique needs of different industries. While tariffs may appear to protect domestic jobs and industries, they often have unintended consequences, raising costs for consumers, disrupting manufacturing, and making domestic companies less competitive internationally. Instead of a broad brush approach, a more strategic, industry-specific policy is needed, one that balances fair trade with economic competitiveness. The future of global trade requires nuanced solutions, targeted tariffs where justified, investment in domestic innovation and manufacturing, and diplomatic negotiations that strengthen rather than isolate the economy. Trade policy should not be about imposing rigid barriers, but about fostering resilience, adaptability, and long-term growth.